Hi, I'm Bryan Schrader, and you're listening to Outstanding in Your Field, powered by Pioneer Agronomy. I'm here with my co-hosts, agronomist Carl Joran and Crystal Williams.
Think of us as IT for your crops. If we know how to fix your issues, we'll tell you. And if not, we've probably got a workaround.
And if we don't, we'll find one because Mother Nature isn't like an on-off switch.
Good morning and welcome to the Outstanding in Your Field podcast. I'm Bryan Schrader, agronomist on the eastern side of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Carl Joran from western Indiana and Crystal Williams from, let's call it eastern central Illinois. How's that, Crystal? Northern?
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
we got it.
We got it.
Good morning, Ryan. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning. How are you guys?
We're great. Hey, so we've got on tap today a little bit of a season, early season update. There's been a whole host of things going on in the field, but in terms of drawing any patterns or common themes, I don't know. It's kind of hit or miss, a whole bunch of one-offs, I'd say, up in my neck of the woods. What's it look like for you all?
Honestly, yeah, mixed bag. So a little bit of, we've got V3 to V6 corn currently, getting some good first trifoliates out on soybeans here. And just we were talking a little bit before we started recording, but I said, I think we should talk about needing rain or, dry conditions. And sounds like Bryan has the opposite experience. So I think we're all a little bit variable in terms of 2026 growing season experiences.
I couldn't agree more. I've got, like you say, Crystal, I've got corn V6, probably, already side dressed and close to, I guess, almost laid by other than maybe a fungicide application. And I've got guys that are actively planting corn in the northern part of the territory today, hoping to get that in before we get rain maybe next week or whatever. So we've got quite a mixed bag, folks spraying herbicide, trying to decide what to do because they couldn't get in because it was wet and trying to make decisions on adding something to it. And so we're just all over the board on different things that need to be done now.
Mm-hmm. Understandable. And we just had a agronomist call here earlier today, just as an update. And sounds like your experience of not quite getting finished planted is similar to Southern Illinois and some parts of southwestern Illinois as well. So quite a gamut of experiences. But to your comment, Bryan, a little bit on herbicides. We've been having some of these conversations and definitely getting some side dress out in our part of the world too. But from a herbicide standpoint, I guess what's some things that we should be keeping in mind as we get into that space or get some rain delays or crop is growing rather rapidly because of the heat?
Yeah, I think the first place that I go, especially with kind of the drawn out spring that we've had, at least here in the eastern edge of Indiana, is just you've got to pay attention to what the cutoff dates are or I guess, the cutoff stages of the crop for these products. We're, in a lot of cases with these early April planted fields, Crystal, we're approaching the end of that label. There's some restrictions on a lot of those things. We've talked a little bit, kind of touched on it, that because of ear formation starting at V5 and V6, we want to be very careful about what we put on that plant because it has to metabolize it. And so you've really got to look at these label restrictions on what size your corn can be, especially when you spray them. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind for me is the size of my crop. Then the second piece is, quite honestly, how big the weeds are. With the amount of GDUs that we had early over here, we had a lot of water hemp specifically, but even giant rag and common rag that got started and well established because we had the early GDU count. And so we had some big weeds. And so some of the labeled rates for certain products or what folks were planning on using maybe is a better way of saying this, wasn't adequate enough to take care of the size of weeds that they need to take care of. And so I think both of those two things are the first place I start, because we may have to, quite honestly, make some significant changes to our herbicide program, either add something or make a rate change or something like that. And so those are really the two things that I've had the most conversations about, at least around herbicide, the last couple weeks.
Yeah, I've got plenty of one-off herbicide challenges. Bryan, you're talking about how y'all are too wet to get finished, and on the east side of the state of Illinois, we're kind of too dry to really feel good about activating rains for pre's on our herbicide program. that's moving up some post sprays by a week or two to try to go ahead and get, make sure weed size doesn't get away from us. But on the sandy acres that I service, we've got ditch banks where you can see the, HPPD injury bleaching out on corn just because it just hasn't had a whole lot of moisture, since it's got up and emerged, and that's got, folks kind of evaluating stands and, contemplating if they should have done something differently. But all comes back to, if Mother Nature gives us a forecast that she can commit to all season long, we could make the proper plan. But as I reflect on as somebody listens to this podcast, you're in the month of June. There are very, very few situations where we would consider starting over on corn, just in principle, right? It's all
Yeah.
about this concept of yield potential. Might not be actualized or realized yield, but yield potential from that earlier planted stand, whatever it is. That yield potential is going to be considerably higher than whatever we're planting in the month of June. Now, again, that's potential. Realized yield, actual yield. We've had plenty of years in the last handful where we've had exceptional crops planted at the end of the May, or I've even had guys say that their best corn was their June planted corn. It all comes down to how we finish the season, what rains we get, how it benefits different planting windows. Just as you're out scouting and you see something that looks amiss, just know that as an agronomist, that's something that we keep in the back of our mind, is that it's got to be really ugly for us to consider hitting the reset button.
Yeah, I mean, recalling the chart, Carl, I mean, you would have to be probably, I would guess, well under 20,000 stand to be able to justify tearing something up and going back. I mean, we're at this point in the calendar that you're talking about probably 75% of this yield if you were planting 30 plus thousand this time of year. I mean, that's just off the top of my head without pulling the chart up real quick. But that's, it, to your point, it would have to be, you wouldn't even call it a stand, is honestly what the real assessment would be.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it wouldn't be a June, agronomy podcast if I didn't have a chance to mention Asiatic garden beetle. Yet again, the grub damage that we're seeing across, the sandier parts of the state. You can get down to the low 20s. It's not uncommon to see a stand reduced to that degree. But there again, experience shows that leaving that stand alone at 20 some thousand, low 20s, we can still reap a pretty good corn crop off of that field, as opposed to ripping it up, starting fresh at 30. Again, you got to think about the biology of these pests. If they're not done doing their damage for 2 more weeks, planting in, where those grubs are even bigger, hungrier, if you will, you may not escape or avoid that pest. And so the concept of replanting to start with a better stand, it could be a misunderstanding. Maybe you get away with it. Maybe you reset the table with a higher rate of insecticide, but Asiatic garden beetle certainly rearing its head yet again. And for folks that are unfamiliar with that pest, as you're out digging, roots and evaluating your early crop, if you see a little white grub, doesn't mean that you have Asiatic garden beetle in terms of a grub. Plenty of misidentification for Japanese beetle grubs and a whole host of other associated white grubs. The Asiatic garden beetle, it's got to have kind of white cheeks. It's got to have the maxillary palps, rather. It looks like Frankenstein's monsters with the bolts coming out of its,
They do.
neck jaw area. So, but you'll know it if you have it, right? If you're in the side dress rig or you're post spraying, you'll see from 6-10 feet up high that all of a sudden you've got erratic stand, and you put your spade in the ground, you'll pop those suckers out quickly. So one note, again, a quick 2-minute plug for Asiatic garden beetle this time of year.
Well, interesting. Oh, go ahead, Crystal.
I was just going to ask, Carl, when you do find that, are you seeing that more in like patterns or pockets, or I guess tell me a little bit more about like distribution when you see that?
Yeah. Happy to indulge, Crystal. Thanks for the question. Asiatic garden beetle, they, so they're in the grub stage right now. When they do their damage in the next couple of weeks, they'll start to transition into into pupa, where they're just hanging out, getting ready to transform into the The beetles themselves. Beetles will fly around the end of June, month of July. They like to be anywhere that's got bushy habitat. So they usually migrate to soybean fields to mate, lay their eggs, or if you've got kind of a weedy field, if we've got a lot of pigweed, if you got a lot of mare's tail, common rag, they're going to go where you've got that type of habitat. So if you have forested areas, usually that gives a little bit more cover for them. So typically I see things in ways of Asiatic garden beetle damage worse along the woods, surrounded by trees than I do, in big sprawling acreages. So yeah, that's a little bit about where you might find it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But very pockety, like any, bug pest, if you will.
Mhm.
You see it in patches and uneven distribution through the field. Oftentimes it'll follow that sandy soil type more so than a loamy soil type. But here again, I've got some loams this year that unfortunately are seeing that grub damage. So it's got us a little bit nervous around these parts.
So thinking back to this past week, we're recording on a Monday, and so I haven't done any service calls or anything this week, but I think back to on Friday, I went out and looked at a field of corn, and the farmer had reported some pockets that just really delayed an emergence, and very isolated in pockets, and just was wondering what could be going on. And so as I went through and investigated, it was interesting because I found like a million things. Not okay, that's exaggerating, but I found several different things that could be contributing to it. So I found a little bit of what could be Rhizoctonia, lab to confirm later, hopefully. I think it was very dry because it also was in the sand knobs. So moisture variance was very key. And then I even noticed some burn on the plants as well, or very limited root growth, leading to me asking more questions about like herbicide history on that field. And there was some classic in the mix here a year ago. And so it was coming off of soybeans. And then even think about I think I found a small hill, could have been from wireworm or something. I mean, or even made me question even about nematodes. So now I've got 5 or 6 things that could be playing into this scenario. And sometimes as we investigate service calls, we always want, a clear-cut answer of this is exactly it, or I've got all these dots, so this all must be connected to something, right? Or, lead to a perfect map of how this exactly happened. Sometimes we just have a laundry list of all the things that came together at once. And, maybe because of it being in sandier soils and drier conditions, we could have had pockets that were a little bit slower to germinate and emerge. And then that seed sat stagnant. And then, the heat cranked up. And, we have a few different things playing against us at once. But, just I'm trying to give comfort if anybody sees some scenarios and scratching their head at what possibly could be happening. All the dots that you might see, they're not always connected, and we can always have multiple things playing at once. And so that's why I was just curious about your patterns. That was kind of one thing that I saw in my pattern here for a service call last week. And so the fun part of our investigative careers, right? So
Yeah. Well, I mean, and sort those into 2 buckets, right? One that is in my control as a farmer and one that is outside of my control, right? And that can give you peace of mind because, again, going back to the idea of if Mother Nature tells us what she's going to do as it relates to weather for the course of the season, well, that may change our plans. But, if say you made a late herbicide application last year because you had weed escapes and there's carryover risk and it's worse in a dry year, a dry winter season. If you know all those things, maybe you do something differently. But ultimately, if you've got bad weed escapes and it's calling for a later post, you're probably doing it, regardless of what the forecast is. So is that in your control? Yeah, you made the decision to manage the weeds that you had as opposed to leading to, 5 years of a awful seed bank to contend with. So I think that's part of it. And then also, us as an agronomist, we have the benefit of everything's in the rear view. We're always telling you what happened, why it happened. It's just like, you listen to ag economists. They're telling you, well, here's why the market moved the way it did. That's all great. But what people want is, tell me where the puck is going. I want to skate
Mhm.
there. Tell me the forecast. Tell me how I should be managing for the future. And I think that's the best part of our roles and the roles of farmers is what is in my control? What can I learn from this situation? What can I do differently next time?
Mhm.
And oftentimes there is nothing that you should have done differently or you should change for the management plan. But sometimes there is, and that's
Mhm.
the opportunity, and that's the whole purpose of this podcast is help
Mhm.
learn and teach where are those opportunities to change, to de-risk, make yourself set up for better crops in the future.
Yes, that specific example, actually, like you said, normally there's not a lot that we can do or manage ourselves, but it was on a pivot. So he planned on watering it because water will help both the classic scenario as well as we had some other seedlings that were just about to pop through and help with some of those bare areas. So, hopefully not going to entirely solve some of those pockets where we did have, a really challenging herbicide spot or where disease might have taken over already. But, hey, that was a solution we could kind of run off of. So that was a positive.
I've got a softball for you all. Purple corn, something that questions started to roll in over the weekend about. How do you talk through purple corn as you get a question from somebody? What should a farmer know?
Number one, this is honestly where I start. This is a good thing. If you really think about what actually is going on in the plant, it is a good thing. It is a reaction to stress. The plant is accumulating sugars in preparation for a prolonged period of stress. So it's the only one that the only, I guess, analogy I have ever been able to come up with is think of your corn like the bear preparing for hibernation. They
Yeah,
eat
I
lots of
like that.
stuff,
I
or
love it.
maybe the squirrel that's grabbing everything and all that. But it's a good thing. We can talk about some of the pioneer old guard, we'll call them, and some of the things that they talked about were positive beyond just this idea of storage of sugars for corn. But the flip side of that is the bottom line is that we just happen to have a bunch of backgrounds that do that more than other people. We're not alone. In my 25 years of being in the corn business now, I can point to some other folks that over the years have had some hybrids that would purple just like Pioneer hybrids. So if somebody says no, it's only Pioneer, not the case. Sorry, it's genetic. It's not brand.
Mhm.
We've seen that before as well. But I start, Carl, quite honestly, explaining that it is a good thing, and then I finish up with the minute it warms up and we get good growing conditions, it will disappear.
Yep.
So it's more complicated than that, but
Yeah.
that's the kindergarten version from Bryan. That's what works for Bryan.
That's funny.
So
And Crystal, your thoughts? What's your
Yeah.
experience with purple
Yeah, no,
corn? You're a Kansas State Wildcat by education, so
we'd love to see
purple's
it.
got a soft spot for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about it.
Well, no, I just think about, even beyond, true purple corn syndrome or whatever it's formally called. I think of varietal differences, right? Like there's going to be some specific lines that do purple a little bit more. One, especially this season, has been 1742 chrome. So, when you can go out into a field and see across, where, half the field is planted to 1742, and you can see it to a line where it's significantly darker. It does lead to some questions, especially, from while you're out scouting, or if you have a scout out there, from a distance, it can look like, oh man, there could be a problem where it's way more reduced compared to this bright green, luscious other hybrid that could be out there. But many of my reps, even last week, were coining it the yield gene that we see sometimes. So several of our higher yielding varieties can have that purple color look. So definitely don't give up, obviously, at the very small growth stage that it could be showing up in. So that's my 2 cents.
I think just one item for folks to be aware of. Just because it's purple on top doesn't mean it's not green, underneath
Yeah.
that superficial layer within the plant. There's no deficit in chlorophyll, everything's there just the way you want it to be. There's no lesser rate of photosynthesis that's taking place. So to take it from kindergarten to 6th grade, Brian, we're not.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's being interrupted here to cause any alarm. But for the uninitiated, this is
Yeah.
part of the pioneer experience in certain genetic backgrounds. Yeah.
And this is not uncommon. There are other plants that do this along with corn. I mean, every plant essentially does this. The difference is the anthocyanin, the pigment that gives us the red and purple that accumulates that you see with that. And that's where, to your point, Crystal, the different hybrid lines are different because it's got to do with the buildup of that pigment and why certain hybrids end up more purple than others. So, I like the way you said it, Carl, new to the pioneer experience. So, you'll do that. You definitely, as you get experience with pioneer hybrids, you'll
and also,
experience purple.
If you're, if you have the opportunity to go walk a pioneer corn plot this time of year, you're going to notice not everything's purple.
Absolutely.
That goes back to the genetic diversity. There is no other offering in the marketplace. I don't care who you are as a redistribution brand that claims that you have more, genetic diversity to offer farmers to, manage risk. There is no more diverse germplasm pool than the Pioneer lineup that we have to offer. So this is one great way to go out and take a look at it. Cob color is another one. You name the plant height, stay green, all that stuff. Different optimal populations, all that stuff comes back to you can identify the diversity in the lineup. Okay, all right. So we've talked a little bit about what has happened. We've got a dry forecast to come with a little bit of heat. We're no stranger to this forecast. I think this is June number 4, where they're talking about it being hot and dry, at least for the short term here. What do y'all think of as an agronomist as it relates to crop management in a hot, dry June? Crystal, you mentioned a pivot turning on already. I know some of that's going to be going on in my neck of the woods too. For those that don't have pivots, what should we do about it?
I guess one thing that comes to mind, and it kind of goes back to Brian's discussion about herbicide management previously, is as I think about post-spraying our soybeans, specifically with Enlist, I'd love to see us, we've had to manage this dry June weather previously too, but incorporating, possibly some MSO into basically, as you think about, a comment was, our crop is going to look a little stagnant. It's not going to shoot out of, grow super rapidly without a lot of moisture. We can kind of look at a reduced stature plant until we get that rain, right? And then it can grow rather quickly. But those weeds are definitely not staying stagnant as they're out in the field. And so as we get into drier conditions, that cuticle or the leaf surface on those weeds does get a little bit hardened off and tougher to penetrate with our herbicides. And so incorporating an MSO or from that oil standpoint to help break through that leaf and get really good coverage on that, I think will be valuable as we look into a drier June.
From a herbicide standpoint, Carl, just because Crystal's talking about Enlist, one of the other things that I'd mention is make sure you're using enough AMS if you're spraying Enlist.
Yes.
That's a huge deal. We know that it's incredibly convenient to use a lot of those liquid products that are there rather than the dry 51-pound bag that everybody just hates trying to get into this tank. The key thing is to make sure you're using the correct amount of AMS. Our colleagues on the crop protection side will tell you that it's not just about conditioning water when we're talking about Enlist, like it is when we're talking about glyphosate usage. There's some things that happen between the AMS and the Enlist that help the Enlist work effectively. And so we've got to make sure we've got the appropriate amount of AMS. And so since Crystal brought up the Enlist application, I would say that. I think for me personally, what I have learned over the last few years is we've had these dry Junes are a couple things. Number one, don't give up on the crop. There's so many people that maybe we planted in marginal conditions. Our crop doesn't look great going through this June, and folks just kind of throw their hands up and say, I'm done. And you mentioned it earlier, you've had growers that tell you that sometimes their June planted corn is some of their best. Sometimes it's their May planted corn. We've got a long way to go. Don't get frustrated by 3 weeks of hot, dry weather. And we don't have pivots over here for the most part, so we can't throw that switch. but don't give up. Manage a crop like the plan says, and we'll see what happens when pollination comes. And so that's one of the big things for me is you just can't give up on the crop. The other thing that I've got when it comes to June is just making sure that we're taking good care of the crop. And what I mean by that is when we're doing something in the field. So in my case, we're going to have some folks side dressing during the time that we're hot and potentially we'll call it dry over here. I don't know that we're going to end up as dry as you guys, but
Mhm.
all that to say, just be mindful of your crop condition. We know that when it's hot and dry, spraying in the middle of the day when it's 95 degrees and the humidity's whatever is not good. Make sure that, when the corn is brittle, if it gets large on you, don't side dress in those kind of conditions. Just be mindful of the conditions and how your crop is reacting to those things. And then we'll address it when we get to a better time of year or a better environment. But just be mindful of like what's really going on in your corn and soybean field and try not to abuse it, I guess I'll say. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but
It does.
without the ability for pivots and things, it's just some of those little bitty things that we can tweak to try to care for the crop, if you will, and get us on down the road.
And when I like discuss like pivots, that is a very small like segment of my or
Sure.
like my geography. But definitely, and even thinking about like other effects of dry conditions for soybeans specifically, one thing like benefit I will say is I feel like the last couple of years, because of it being so dry in June, is, yes, we will start flowering here. But some of those super low level flowers sometimes don't end up making it, which means your pod sets are going to end up a little bit higher on the plant, which definitely makes those combine operators very happy as you maybe catch a few less rocks, but no guarantees there.
Well, one thing that I think about this time of year, right? We've talked about the components of corn yield, just staying focused on corn for a moment, but kind of this V5-ish time frame is when you're determining the number of kernels around. That's largely genetically determined, right? A significant majority of that's based on what's in the bag, not what you do to it or what Mother Nature does to it. But this concept of mitigating stress at every turn that we have the opportunity. I'm interested in the concept of managing, the plant's hormones. It's something we've touched on a little bit in this program in the past, but cytokinin being one of those that kind of degrades, if you will, when you've got a lot of heat or a lot of drought stress. And if we can keep that balance of plant hormones in check, perhaps that's something that can keep the stomates open for a little bit longer. You could maintain cell division. These are things that as it gets really hot and dry out, the corn plant, the factory is going to start slowing down, right? You're gonna kick off second shift. You might start to see the leaves start to curl up a little bit, and if it's exceptional, then you get into this spot of pineapple looking corn, and you're really reducing the amount of photosynthate that you're creating. So this idea of being able to regulate cytokinins by actually physically applying some of them foliarly before you get that drought stress to set in is something that I'm very eager to take a look at some demonstrations. I know I've got a couple growers that are looking to split an 80 into two 40s, and I'm hoping to maybe get some interesting pictures here to see how that all comes together. But for folks that are interested in that concept, there's an EPA registered product called Next to Stand that's meant to be applied foliarly, with your corn herbicide post pass. And I recognize we're literally in the middle of that, so this might be as much education as opposed to true sourcing of a product like that. But really excited to see this kind of next level agronomic management using some new tools to see if we can reduce stress, keep the factory moving full tilt. And perhaps that means you can continue to assimilate more and more of those components of yield, and hopefully that manifests into realized yield, not just yield potential at the end of the season.
Very good call out, Carl. As we look at our time, we're kind of wrapping up here. Any other final comments as our listeners here in the first week of June, and we'll catch them back later mid-June? Any other thoughts?
I think we've done a pretty good job of kind of going around the gamut to touch on some things. I think right now we're in that kind of window that we always end up in, where we've got some folks that have, got a crop really taken off, and we got some folks just trying to get finished up. And so
Mhm.
it'll be really interesting, to Carl's point about when yields are good, whose yields will be the best this year. Will it be the early April planted stuff, or will it be this late May, early June planted stuff this year?
Mhm. Mhm. Quite a bit of variable. Absolutely. Time will tell, definitely. So, anyways, we will catch everybody next time. Thank you for joining us.
This has been another episode of Outstanding in Your Field. Like and follow our podcast wherever you are listening. We've got a new episode at least once a month. You can also find us on YouTube by following Pioneer Seeds. You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader.
I'm Crystal Williams. You can contact me at crystal.williams@pioneer.com.
And I'm Carl Jorn. You can follow along with me at CJorn on X or on Facebook at CJorn Agronomy. That's CJOERN.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy video podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.